Thunder, what was the first script that you were ever commissioned to write? Can you recall?
The first script I was ever commissioned to write, not an option. You know, I'd written a couple of scripts on my own that got optioned. The first script I was ever actually hired to write was for The Asylum. It was a film called 200 Miles Per Hour, which was basically a car racing movie.
And The Asylum, they distribute sort of what they call mockbusters.
Mockbusters and B movies, low budget stuff.
Right. Okay, so was that script easier to write than one that you thought up on your own and were the driving engine behind? Was it easier to know that people were counting on you and that there possibly could be money behind it, or is it harder to be your own band leader?
I think it's harder, in a lot of ways it's harder to write your own script because there's nobody providing parameters, guidelines. So, you know, you can do anything, and that means you have to control yourself, you have to narrow yourself down every day. You have to be your own sort of critic. And that requires thinking in a lot of different ways, whereas when you know you have an approved storyline and this is what they want and you just have to deliver it, in some ways that's a lot easier because there are fewer decisions to make at every turn. On the other hand, that first script I had to write, 200 miles per hour, from the day they gave me the assignment, it needed to be done in 10 days. So,
no pressure.
And I'd never written a feature script that quickly before. So that was an interesting challenge. I was basically chained to my computer 12 hours a day.
So what are some tips that you can share in terms of not finding reasons to get up from the desk and making excuses? Because I'm sure that might have been easier knowing that there was this ticking clock.
Yeah, when there's a deadline, it's a lot easier to force yourself to just stay there. You know how many pages you have to write on average each day to be finished by the date they set for you. And if you're not making that quota, you know you're screwing up, and someday you're going to be up 24 hours straight trying to make up for it. So it's when you've got a deadline, it's a lot easier to discipline yourself. At the same time, in my experience, screenwriting is 80% surfing the web, doing dishes, walking the dog, all the while hopefully you're thinking about what you're going to be writing, and then 20% of the time you're actually typing away.
So speaking of that, when you are your own band leader, for lack of a better word, what are some tips that you can use to keep yourself again in that chair, or is it all part of this process of just observation?
You know, honestly, I think it's a double-edged sword, because you can justify a lot of goofing off during the writing process as letting the creative juices flow and build and letting your mind wander a bit. You know, the truth is, not so much storytelling, but story creating happens in the subconscious. And sometimes if you just sit there and you stare at a computer screen or you stare at a blank piece of paper waiting for words to come, it's a more forced artificial process. Whereas, you know, sitting in a park watching people interact, you might get an idea for something. So, on the other hand, you can waste way too much time doing that. So it's a double-edged sword, and you have to find a way to discipline yourself. And you know, that's going to be different for everybody. The way I do it is to set myself a page quota. I have to write a certain number of pages each day. And if I've wasted time on the internet or in pointless Facebook debates, which seem to occupy an increasingly large amount of time, you know, I don't let myself get up. I don't let myself go to bed or whatever. I don't leave the computer until I've reached that quota. So that's really the only way for me that's really proven to be effective. Because otherwise, you know, I'll write one good little bit, and I'll be all proud of myself, and then I'll go do something else. And at the end of the day, I discovered that, well, that was a good bit, but it was only half a page, and now I have 10 pages to write tomorrow instead of 5. So keeping to a daily quota is really something that's been effective for me.
Are you a harsh taskmaster for yourself, or are you sort of like one of these lenient parents, real gentle with yourself? And
Again, it depends on whether I'm writing on deadline. If I have a deadline and I know when something has to be done and it's a paying job, I'm a pretty harsh taskmaster. When I'm writing a spec script for myself, I tend to go a bit easier on myself on the theory that creativity is what's most important here. I'm not on deadline and I don't need to meet somebody else's schedule, and I should just let it flow. But again, that's really just self-justification, and there's a huge amount, I think there's a huge amount of laziness involved in being a screenwriter, to be honest with you.
we had a comment come in from Brianna, and she wrote, "I like screenwriting, but my dialogue always seems boring and I never know what to add." How can you spice up dialogue? What's your reaction to that?
Dialogue, writing good dialogue is it's a bit of an arcane art. As much as screenwriting is a craft, there's a dark art to it, and sometimes these things just have to come to you. One good trick is to try and keep your sentences as short as possible, which forces you to write in a punchier fashion. That's something that I guess I learned from my journalist father. Although honestly, I tend to break that rule a lot, so I'm probably a bit hypocritical there.
Maybe you're rebelling.
Maybe I did that enough. There's an old rule that you enter a scene as late as possible and you leave it as early as possible, and you make sure that you hit the main point of that scene. And if you keep that in mind, that will also tend to focus your dialogue. Remembering who your characters are, just trying to, what I do is I tend to be the hero. In the first Sharknado, I didn't know Ian Ziering was going to play Finn. So that character was just me. What would I do if I were thrown into this insane situation? And so then I write as my ideal self. What would I like to say in that situation? What would I like to do? Because in everyday life, we all have these moments where somebody says something to us and we just go, and we don't know what to say. And then 10 minutes later, it comes to you what you should have said to that person. And the beauty of screenwriting is you can wait 10 minutes until you figure it out and then write it down.
So if you're writing a villain character, where do you go? Because we all have, still cliche, the dark and the light. But
right.
So where do you go?
I found two ways to write villain characters. And mind you, I've noticed an interesting thing about my own writing, and this is something I'm just sort of discovering, is that I tend to not write villains. I don't like bad people. So my villains tend to be external forces, a tornado full of sharks, zombies, an enemy ship, hostile aliens, things that you don't really have to get to know. And that's something that I've just recently been discovering about myself and thinking that, I've got to sort of explore writing more interesting, personal, evil characters. And how does one do that? Obviously, one can simply take all of your anger and self-justification at things that happen to you in the world and sort of bundle them and hang on to them and focus them into this character. And the other way to do it is to think of the people in your life who are pissing you off the most and then imbue your bad guy characters with some of those traits. But at the same time, you have to remember that everybody, even the most evil character, I'm sure even Adolf Hitler, thought he was doing something right. And so you have to be able to establish a logic and a self-justification for any bad guy, for them to have internal credibility. And because if they don't have that, they just become cartoon Dick Dastardly characters, twirling their mustaches. And I'm actually writing one of those right now, and one of my challenges is, how do I justify this character to himself?
We had a comment come in from Anonymous.
I know who that is.
Anonymous in Seattle.
Yeah. Oh, then I don't.
Hello, I have an idea for a movie, but nobody gives me a chance.
I
Can you
can't hear
help me?
that. No. It's funny. Since Sharknado, I get a lot of people on Twitter and Facebook and contacting me through my website saying, "Hey, I've got this great idea for a movie, and I think you'd love it." And there are so many legal reasons why you can't hear them, and so many people have such similar ideas, especially since Sharknado, because it just gives rise to this mashup title thing, and Barricane, and what was the other one I really liked? Snailnado. It'll be slow moving, so there'll be plenty of time for character development. And you get literally dozens, if not hundreds, of people sending the same idea. And you can get in a lot of trouble that way. I've seen people have actually tried to send me ideas that I've already had. And okay, well, now if they see this bit in a movie I write, they're going to say, "Hey, he stole that from me." But no, I didn't. It's just there are similar ideas out there. So it's a tricky thing. At the same time, you want to be open to the possibility that somebody out there, some undiscovered talent, really does have a great idea, and so maybe you should explore that. And even then, it's a tricky proposition.
Well, I'm wondering if Anonymous was more keeping in the vein of like, I have these ideas, but no one.
How do I break in?
Yeah, I think.
Well, that's an awfully good question, because I've been trying to break in for 20 odd years, and it's been sort of a slow moving process. They'll tell you get an agent, but of course that's even harder these days than getting into some production companies. There are a couple of tried and true parameters, and they don't work very well. There are writing contests. There's a thing called inktip.com, where you can list a synopsis in their quarterly or monthly newsletter that they distribute to producers. And early on, I had a little success with that, and at the same time, they have a weekly email blast that you can get, and there will be a couple of producers that you can submit ideas to who are looking for specific things. They'll tell you what they are looking for, and you can submit to that. You can write query letters to agents. You can write query letters to producers. Really, the best advice, though, is to come to LA and network. There's really no substitute for it, and most writers hate doing that. We're not salespeople. To this day, we're sitting in my manager's office, and every time I come into this room, he's telling me, "Look, you got to be a salesman." And I'm like, "I'm not a salesman, I'm a screenwriter, damn it." But that's the nature of the beast, and you have to learn to do that, as distasteful as it is. And if you have the right kind of personality, and you can go to a Hollywood party, or an off Hollywood party, but somebody might be there. The old saw about 6 degrees of separation. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who can do something for you. And the more people you meet, the better your odds become. It's a mathematical process. Eventually, you're going to strike somebody who can help you out. And then the final thing, and this worked for me early on in my career when I first came to LA, is to find shows that really talk to you, things you really like, whether they're movies or TV shows. And just send an email or send a letter. You can look it up in the Hollywood Reporter or Variety, or there are so many online resources now. Find a person. Don't hit the star. Don't hit the top level executive producer, but find somebody who works on that show that the public at large doesn't know, and send them a personal contact. That worked for me a couple of times. There was a TV show when I came out here called War of the Worlds, the TV series. It only lasted a year or two. But I really liked it. And so I called up their production office, and I asked to speak to I got the names of one of the producers, and I asked to speak to him. And I had to go through 3 different levels of assistance, and finally they said, write us a letter, send us something. And so I sent them my student film. But eventually he called me back, and he said, hey, I like what you did here, why don't you come in and talk? And he didn't hire me that day. To this day he hasn't hired me. But we've become great friends, and he's sort of been a mentor for me over the years. Another situation, after Die Hard and The Hunt for Red October, I was in love with the work that John McTiernan was doing as a director. And so I called his office and tried to speak to him. And of course I never got to John McTiernan, but I spoke to his assistant. And she and I sort of started a conversation, and I would call back every 2 weeks saying, hey, do you think he could look at my film? And then I sent my film, and hey, has he looked at my film yet? And I didn't bug them. I did it every couple of weeks. And eventually she said, why don't you come in and talk to me? So I went in and I had lunch with her, and I got to sit in on dailies one day during Hunt for Red October. And she and I became great friends. And she actually is the one who put me in touch with the first producer who hired me to direct something. So you never know where these opportunities are going to be coming from. You just have to be on the lookout for anything, because the front doors are locked. You gotta crawl in through one of the back windows.
How was it at first when you were getting ready to go have lunch with that assistant? Back then, were you rehearsing the dialogue?
I've never been good at pitching. I can't sit there and say, okay, now picture this. That's what they tell you to do, and I'm just no good at it. I tell people what my story is, and I hope they can see what I see. But that first time I was going in to meet John McTiernan's assistant, I was scared out of my mind. I remember driving to, I think it was to the Paramount lot. And the whole day was kind of a blur. I mean, I walked into the office. They were in the middle of shooting Hunt for Red October. And as I was walking into the office to meet her, Alec Baldwin was walking out in his naval uniform. And I was like, holy crap. It's all kind of a blur, to be honest. But somehow, once I sat down with her, and it was just me and her, 2 people having a conversation, all of that went away. And I remembered why I was there, and I remembered how much I want to do this, and I talked about how much I had liked what McTiernan had done in Die Hard and Predator, and I asked her how they got their start, and she was actually more than his assistant. She was basically his business partner, and they had made his first film together. She had produced it, so I was asking her how they did that, and I was telling her about my student film. And it just became a conversation. And the key to this business is just really getting to know people. The key, it's a cliche. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And that's true. So often I've had meetings where the whole point is simply to get to know somebody. They're not going to buy the idea I'm pitching. They're not even in the market for it. But get to know them, establish a relationship. So 6 months or a year down the line, when you have an idea that might be right for them, you can call them up and say, hey, hi, how are you? And they'll say, yeah, hi, how are you? And they'll say, hey, I've got something that really might work for you.
So do you think that over the past 20 years, since you've been in LA, that's been the key to your success?
God, what a depressing thought. I've been here that long.
Well, we've known people that have turned around and been here less time and have given up. And there's that famous Harrison Ford story. The 20 years, the house, all the roommates.
Right.
Sorry. So is that the key, the relationships, but also you must have had work and ideas to back it up, because just being friends with someone or having their business card and calling, I don't think is...
Well, right. The relationships are key to getting your foot in the door and to getting your work in front of the right people. But if your work's no good, all the relationships in the world usually won't help you. Not always. I've seen some truly bad material produced, probably because of great relationships. But for somebody breaking in, you've got to have the work. You've got to be able to back up what you say.
Was there a key decision that you look back on and say, okay, this is what led to then B, C, and D and has got me here?
Yeah, when I was 6 years old, my mother decided that I could stay up late to watch Star Trek. And that literally is where it all started for me, because that show, I'm talking about the original Star Trek, that show just opened my eyes to a world other than what I saw in front of me every day as a little kid. And I think that's where my imagination really started to reach out and see what I could envision. And then somebody gave me a book called The Making of Star Trek. Mind you, I was way too young to read this very dry technical book, so I went to the picture section. And the very first picture in the photo section of The Making of Star Trek is these 1960s studio technicians doing some sort of work on the bridge of the Enterprise. And something just clicked in my head. You know, I wanted to be Mr. Spock or Captain Kirk, but I knew that wasn't real, and that was about the limit of my understanding at that age. And then here were these real people working on the bridge of the Enterprise. And something just clicked for me, like, there is a way to work on the Enterprise. I can go do that. You know, and over the next 5 or 10 years of childhood and adolescence, there were a lot of different things that I thought maybe I would do when I grew up. But that always stuck with me. And so the key moment was my mom letting me stay up to watch Star Trek. You're probably not looking for that. Key moment in my career. You know, looking back on it, there were two. The first was meeting John McTiernan's assistant, because she eventually put me in touch with the producer who would hire me as my first directing job. That job ended up not going so well. It was actually a disaster. But having that first professional credit and having been referred to a working producer from somebody else he knew in the business gave me a certain amount of credibility that I was then able to build on and develop further relationships out of that. And then the other moment was, for many, many years, I had told myself, look, if things don't work out, I will raise money and I will make an independent film myself. Because so much of this business, if you're a director primarily, less as a writer, because as a writer you just write something, and if it's really good, people will see that if they read it. And so the trick is just getting them to read your script. But as a director, you have to direct something to prove what you can do. And often shorts are just, you know, ignored by the industry to a certain extent. People, for some reason, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, producers see a well-done short and in their head they'll go, oh yeah, but that's just a short. Where's your feature? And you know, most people don't have features because they're very expensive to make. And if they're not very expensive, they tend to look like crap. So in the back of my head, I always had this idea that if I didn't break in eventually, and I was never sure what eventually meant, that I would raise money and make an independent film. And I should have probably done that in my late 20s or when I hit 30. But it took another 5 or 6 years before I finally decided that none of these almost happened jobs had ever actually happened, and so I should just buckle down and do this. And so that's what happened, is myself and a partner, we put together a business plan. We raised $150,000, and we made a film. And it was that film that finally got David Latt, one of the partners at the asylum, to take me seriously, even though I'd known him for 10 years. I'd just been a friend. I'd just been that guy, oh yeah, that guy who wanted to make movies but never had. So now I had this thing that I could put in front of him and say, here, look, this is entertaining. People watch this and they enjoy it. and he couldn't deny that. And so, he put me in touch with his director of development, and they started including me when they were looking for new ideas, and eventually we moved on to making a film together.
So would you say that was your defining moment when you actually became a professional? Because the Steven Pressfield model of that resistance from the War of Art, where they say that I don't know if you've read the book. It's fantastic.
I have not.
Okay.
I have it. It's one of those things on the shelf. Say I've got to read this, but it's important.
Well, he talks about the resistance, whether it's from people around you, whether it's from yourself, and once that artist breaks through that being so fearful to show that film or whatever it is that's stopping them, those excuses, that's kind of the moment when they turn pro, so to speak. So do you think that was the moment when you finally said, you know what, I've had enough trying to almost get this job, I've come close, for some reason I haven't made it, I've always been cut out, but this time I'm doing it, I'm going to have that thing to put in front of people. And that was the moment that you turned professional, that you turned
that was certainly a breakthrough. Deciding to raise money and make an independent film was certainly a breakthrough moment for me. I hesitate to say that's when I became a professional, because it was nearly 10 years before that I'd been hired to direct a film. And so I would argue that you're a professional as soon as somebody pays you to do what you do. But coming to the conclusion that nobody was going to do it for me and I had to make this happen myself was certainly the key moment in getting to where I am today. And mind you, where I am today is no great shakes. I mean, maybe Sharknado II will come out and people will realize that the first one wasn't a fluke and that we actually know what we're talking about. And then myself and Anthony, the director, and some other people involved will be taken even more seriously. But that was the key moment that led to where I am now, and hopefully will lead to even more.
Have you looked back at your life and said, what would have happened if I hadn't talked to the Sci-Fi Channel about writing the script, hadn't followed through, where would I be?
I look back at my life and wish I had made that independent film 5 or 10 years earlier. Because that is kind of what started the ball rolling. And if I had done that a lot earlier, I think through one means or another, I would have picked up steam along the same path, along the same timeline as I have, but I'd be 10 years younger, and and have more energy and have more not optimism. That's not the word I'm looking for, because actually have a lot of optimism right now. This is bad for a writer because now I don't have the word that I need. I wish I had done it sooner, because I think I would be much further along now than I am.
Is it blind confidence? You know how in youth people think there's no way they can fail, and I envy that. You don't overthink it. You just say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be the next whatever." And you
no, because I still think I'm the next Steven Spielberg. I still have blind confidence and blind optimism. But my manager in particular keeps saying, "Look, we've got to take this one step at a time. You did Sharknado. Now we build on that. You do something like it, but bigger, for lack of a better word. And then you take that and you do something else, but you can't move right on to doing Shakespeare because nobody's going to take the writer of Sharknado seriously when he says he wants to do Shakespeare. I don't actually want to do Shakespeare, but there are serious, genre films that I want to make that aren't tongue-in-cheek. And so it frustrates me because I'm already at the point in my life where I just want to be doing what I do. And I feel like I've paid my dues and I've been doing this for a very long time. But you've got to put that in check. You've got to take your ego down a notch. You really have to take your ego out of the equation. and say, okay, this is how I am perceived by the world and by the industry. I have to accept that, even though that's not the sum total of who I am as a person or as a professional. I have to accept that this is the way I'm seen now, so how do I build on that to get to where I want to be? I completely forgot what your question was.
Oh, wow, that's great. Sorry, I got lost in what you were saying, and I forgot my question too. I think I was talking about resistance and the moment that you realize that, but it sounds like being paid as a writer, that does give a professional stamp. But there must have been something very freeing in terms of your whole process of going out and actually doing what you were saying, doing what you said you were going to do.
I'm glad you said that phrase, because that's something that I've realized, is that for many years I had developed a lot of connections in the business, and I was telling people that I was a good writer and director, mainly a director. To be honest, it's a little frustrating for me that the success and the public perception that I've achieved as a result of Sharknado and some of the other smaller things I've done is largely as a screenwriter, because I've always seen myself as a director first and a screenwriter second. So that's kind of frustrating. But the phrase "doing what I said I could do" is key, because for years and years I'd been telling people what I could do if they would just give me a chance. But that required them taking a leap of faith on me. And why should they do that when they're at risk? Every film any producer makes, every film even a studio makes, they're risking their entire business model, their entire profession, their entire position in the industry on every project they make. So why on earth should they take a risk, a leap of faith on me, an unproven quantity, when they can hire Steven Spielberg or James Cameron or Ridley Scott or Shane Black or whoever that they know is going to deliver? And of course the argument that the young filmmaker will make is, yes, but I have something new that those guys don't have. They've been doing this. We all know what they can do. That's legitimate to a certain extent, but not from a business standpoint. From a business standpoint, you go with somebody that you know can deliver. You need to be able to show people that you can do what you say you can do. And if you're just a screenwriter, then that means writing a really kick-ass script and putting it in front of somebody and making the first page so good that they have to keep reading to page 5, and making the first 5 pages so good they have to keep reading to page 10, and making the first 10 pages so good that they never put it down until they get to the last page, and they have to pick up the phone and call you as soon as they're done. That's how good your script has to be. And it can't be that good that you can't think it's that good. All your friends have to read it and think, holy shit, this is the best thing I've ever read. Can I say that on your...
Yeah, please.
We're on the internet, right?
Yeah, please. We'll censor it for the ratings.
Okay. And then your friends have to show it to their friends. And people who don't even know you have to read this and think, this is the best thing I've ever read. I can't wait to see this on television or in the movies. And when you have a script that's getting that kind of reaction from your friends, then you can walk into somebody's door and say, here, this is what I can do. Read this and you will hire me. And you'll have that confidence to go into the room and exude that. And if you have that confidence, people will read that first page. If you walk into somebody's office and you feel that way about your material, and you know without a shadow of a doubt that this is a great script, that gets across to people, and they'll read your first page. But if your first page is amateurishly written, they're going to stop right there. Somebody sent me a great idea, and it was one of the few times in the last year where somebody contacted me, said, hey, I have this idea for a movie. I've written a script. Would you read it? And the pitch, which they actually broke the rules, and they sent me the pitch in the very first email, so that I had, I would have had to stop reading and, to not have been exposed to the idea. And fortunately, it was not an idea I already had. But it was an interesting idea. And so I said, sure, send me the script. And, we did a release form, and they sent me the script. And I got the script, and I was really excited to read it. And the first page, I opened it up, and it wasn't even formatted properly. And I read the first page, and they weren't writing in proper sentences. And I had to slog through this thing to figure out what they were trying to say. And I gave up after a couple of pages because they'd abused me, basically. They'd stolen my time, they'd wasted my time on something that wasn't a professional product, that could never be produced in its current state. And maybe if I had forced myself to read the whole script, there would have been a nugget in there that was a great idea, and with some work, I could have pounded the script into shape and tried to do something with it. But who has that time? And who knows? You could get to the end of this 120-page script. It takes you 2 hours out of a very busy day. And you get to the end, and it could all have been crap. Even though that one-sentence pitch they sent me was a good idea. So you got to be sure, and you can't just read it yourself and think it's great. Other people have to be telling you it's great. As a director, you have even a tougher road than as a screenwriter, because you can't just sit by yourself and create something and show it to somebody and impress them. You have to be able to do what you say you can do. And for a director, that means putting together a lot of people, and even for a cheap film, a lot of money, relatively speaking, and a lot of time. I mean, making a feature film is an investment of 6 months to 2 years out of your life. And during that time, you have to figure out how to live, too. So that's a harder road to hoe, so to speak. And somehow you have to find a way to do that, because just telling somebody you have a great idea, just describing it to them, if you're a good artist, if you can draw, that will help a lot, because you can do your own storyboards. You can maybe even do them in color. You can do a graphic novel, a comic book. Even if it doesn't get published, you can put it in front of somebody and say, here, this is what my movie would be. And that can help. And if it's really great, if it's really cool, maybe they'll take a chance on you. More likely they'll say, that's really cool, we're going to buy the rights from this and we'll hire somebody else to make it. So going out and finding a way to make a feature, and finding a way to make a feature that's good on whatever you're able to raise. So don't go out and raise $50,000 and make Star Wars, because it's going to look like crap. It's going to look like, never mind what it's going to look like. But find a subject matter that you can do well on whatever amount of money you're able to put together. And if it means 2 people sitting in a room talking, then write and then create the most amazing, interesting, wonderful 2 people sitting in a room talking film you can do. Almost anybody these days, with the technology that's available to us, can make a well-produced film of 2 people sitting at a table talking. And if you can find a way to make that interesting, you might impress somebody. And they might say, okay, we're not going to give you $50 million, but here's $200,000. Go make 3 people sitting in a room talking. Go make 2 people sitting in a park talking. Go make something that you'll have a bit better opportunity to show what you can do. And that's all I've done, is step by step. I've made slightly better and better, bigger and bigger films. And it was because of those, these films I made for the Asylum, they were Mockbusters. I mean, I didn't think of them that way. I'm not trying to rip off other people's movies. That doesn't interest me in the slightest, and I'm not trying to satirize them. The idea of the mockbuster from the Asylum's playbook is not so much to satirize the individual project, but to satirize the idea that $200 million is required to make an entertaining movie. It's not. And so for $200,000 or $300,000 or $350,000, I made a couple of movies for them that were, incrementally bigger and better than the independent film I'd made that got me those jobs. And it was the fact that I had done one of these films for them well. I delivered the script that they wanted. I delivered it on time. I was relatively easy to work with during the development process. I don't know if the director of development would agree with me 100% on that, because any creative people are going to have clashes. But in the end, I remember that they're the ones paying the bills, and they understand what their market is, so I give them what they want. And then I go out and I make the best film I possibly can on the money they give me. And I put together the best team of people who aren't going to say, oh, it's only a $200,000 crappy asylum mockbuster. They're going to say, we're going to make this the best battleship movie we can, or the best alien planet movie we can, or the best zombie film we can, given the resources available to us. And it was the fact that I had done that and delivered to them what they needed, and something that showed I actually cared about the material, and that I had some intelligence and I had some style. It was that made them come to me and say, we want you to write a movie called Sharkstorm. And for me to be in a position to say, no, why would I want to write a movie called Sharkstorm? Haven't we had enough dumb shark movies? And they went away and said, all right, we'll find somebody else to do it. And then a month later, they came back to me and they said, what we really want you to do is write a movie called Sharknado. And I said, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And if I can write it that way, then sure, I'll do it. I'd love to do it. And thank God they said, yes, it's okay to be ridiculous on a movie called Sharknado. And from there, in the last 2 years, I've had some modicum of success that hopefully now is leading to bigger and better things. But it's all because step by step I proved that I was reliable, that I could do what they needed me to do. And I only got that opportunity because I'd done what I said I could do. I went out, I raised the money, I made this film. And instead of just saying, take a chance on me, I said, here, this is what I can do, and I can do it for you.
Staying on the theme of mockbusters, do you have any tips on writing sort of outrageous, unbelievable moments in a scene, but having the actors remain within that reality?
Well, that's the key to something like Sharknado, is writing outrageous things and having the characters stay planted in the reality. And that's the narrow line we had to walk on that. I did it on Sharknado, and I think one of the reasons that they really wanted me to do Sharknado is I had done exactly that on my independent film, Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood. Is that I had written a lot of ridiculous stuff, but the characters remained planted in the reality they were in. If the actors start winking at the camera, I didn't do that right. It should have been, if the actors start winking at the camera, it just strays into farce. And unless you're really, really funny, that will fall flat. On the other hand, if you play it too seriously and it's not self-aware enough to know what it is, then that falls flat. And I think the reason that Sharknado connected the way it did is that a lot of these kinds of movies with the crazy mashup titles and the insane premises have been played completely straight or completely winking at the camera. And what we tried to do with Sharknado was walk that line where the characters are enmeshed in the reality, no matter how ridiculous the reality is. But the filmmakers are saying to the audience, we know how ridiculous this is, but isn't it fun? When I wrote Sharknado, all I really did was I put myself in that situation. They said, okay, a tornado full of sharks. This is what you have to write a movie about. So, okay, how do we get a tornado full of sharks? I actually took a fairly logical, realistic approach to it. How would we get a tornado full of sharks? Well, tornadoes can spin off from hurricanes. And there are documented cases of fish being sucked up into the air by tornadoes and waterspouts that form over the ocean. Okay, so now I have a logical basis. Tornadoes spin off hurricanes over the ocean. There's happened to be a large concentration of sharks in that area. The waterspouts suck up the sharks, and now we have sharknadoes. Okay, well, that's step one. Step two was creating a larger environment for that to take place in. What would happen if a hurricane hit Los Angeles? So I had a realistic disaster movie, because with global warming and everything, if not likely, it's at least less unlikely that a hurricane could hit Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a city that floods if it rains for 5 minutes. So what would happen if a hurricane hit here? So that was a reasonable, realistic disaster movie. So I took that and I put a character in it that was me, basically. I'm the hero in that movie. What would I do if I was in this situation? Well, I've been reading science fiction my whole life, so I've always been prepared for the zombie apocalypse or for a comet to hit the Earth or what have you. And I've always, even if I don't have a huge compound somewhere waiting for the end of the world, I've at least thought about what I would do in a disaster scenario. So, okay, I took some of that and put that in there and gave Finn my motto, Semper Paratus, which means always prepared. And I took this realistic approach to it. And then I added the unrealistic Sharknadoes. And all I really did was say to myself, okay, what would I do if this actually happened? And then the difference between this and a realistic disaster movie is that when you get to the point where you say, this is ridiculous, this could never happen, this isn't believable, this isn't realistic, you don't worry about that. You just keep going. As long as the characters stay in that reality and address what's happening to them in a believable fashion, as long as you as the audience can say, yeah, that's what I'd do if a tornado full of sharks started coming at me. Or at least that's what I would do if I was really brave and I was forced to not hide. What would I do if a tornado full of sharks was coming at me? Writing Sharknado, you still have the same dramatic requirements of any good movie. You still need to develop character. It still needs to go from point A to point B to point C. The characters need to be in jeopardy. They have to develop as they go along. You have to build suspense. You have to reveal things as you go. You have to reach a climax where it looks like the characters are, shit out of luck and they're going to die. You have to follow all the same requirements of good screenwriting. You simply don't have to stop when you get to the point where it would ordinarily stop being realistic or believable. We get to keep going. So it's a real movie with real characters in an unbelievable situation, forced to be believable, I think. Or I could be full of shit. There's really no telling.
So the media storm and the Twitter blitz that ensued with the first Sharknado, from having a father that was a journalist and being exposed to that industry, what tips did you take away from him or observe from him that helped you handle that viral success?
Interesting. I think growing up with a journalist father and a very proper British mother, I don't know that they actually prepared me for the specifics of how I handled the explosion of interest after Sharknado. But what they did was they gave me a well-rounded and worldly perception. I was exposed to a lot of different stuff as a kid, not just the little slice of life that I would otherwise have grown up in. My father was also a professional wine critic. So we not only did we have our middle class life in New York City, not only was I exposed to, ideas regarding the world and politics and all that stuff, but we also traveled in some social circles well above our actual financial standings, because as a wine critic, you're sort of forced into the upper echelons of society. So I really got to see how just the other half lived, but how all the different halves lived. And I think just having sort of a well-rounded perception helped keep me from getting too overwhelmed during the attention blitz that followed the release of Sharknado. And the other thing really that I credit is simply that I had spent 20 years trying to get into this business. If this had happened, if Sharknado had happened when I was in my mid-20s, when I came out here intending for something like this to happen, I'd probably be so screwed up right now. I'd probably be a raging egomaniac. But years of being humbled, being beaten down, sort of, banging my head against doors that wouldn't open for me, I think has helped me keep a level head during all of this. That and the fact that things like this just don't happen, and for this to happen even once is an incredible blessing. And there's sure as hell no way I could expect it to ever happen again. So I had to take maximum advantage of it. When you get an opportunity, you've got to take it for all it's worth. So if I had just let this go to my head and I'd gone off and become, like a Hollywood party person, instead of buckling down and doing every interview I could and taking every meeting I could, getting an agent, making the most out of this professionally that I could, and trying to keep my own sense of self in check and intact, was vitally crucial to my perception of my future progress and future happiness. I'd been working to become an overnight success for 20 years, and here was my opportunity. So if I screwed this up, I'd just have to, blow my brains out or something. So I couldn't allow myself to be overwhelmed or to get carried away. And mind you, I've been a bit overwhelmed and a bit carried away. But I've been able to temper that. And sometimes doing a lot of press, that whole first week after Sharknado came out, it's just a blur. That night was the most surreal experience of my life. And then the next morning when I started getting calls for interviews, and 2 days later I was shooting a segment for Good Morning America. I mean, things like this don't happen. And so I've just tried to enjoy it, but at the same time, friends look at me and say, "Why aren't you partying? Why aren't you jumping for joy? Why aren't you just going nuts?" And I am. But it's on the inside. I'm trying to maintain some kind of equilibrium, because I know that I have to make the most of this that I possibly can if I want to do and be what I always said I was going to do and be.
What can the fans of the first Sharknado expect with Sharknado, the second one?
Sharknado II, the second one, is basically going to be bigger and better than the first. On the first one, we made a $100 million film for less than $1 million, and it shows. Let's not kid ourselves about that. At the same time, I think the fact that we were reaching for that is part of what made it endearing. On the second one, we're making a $200 million film on again about 1% of the money we should have. but by virtue of the fact that it takes place in New York, and although we didn't think it at the time, the weather really helped us because we were shooting a movie that's supposed to take place in the summer in February and March of one of the worst winters the East Coast has seen in recent memory. And so we were cursing the weather on a daily basis, but it gave us the look of an extreme weather pattern that naturally a Sharknado would bring. So it's going to feel like a much bigger, better movie. We knew that people had taken to the first one in a certain way, and so we were able to guide the second one to be what we thought they would want it to be. So it's not any more tongue-in-cheek, and it's not any more serious than the first one. We still walk that same line, but we reveled in the sense of glee and fun that I think the first one evoked. And so anybody who really liked the first one is going to love the second one. And the people who hated the first one and who said it was the worst movie ever made won't be able to say that about the second one, but I think they'll still have fun interacting with it the way they did the first one.
Do you have a message for the Twitter people out there? Anything that you want to convey?
I hope everybody on Twitter just has the same fun with this one that they did with the first one, and I hope they take it to their hearts, because that's why we're here. If it weren't for the folks on Twitter, we wouldn't be here doing this. So this is for you.